Tonight, we are telling the story of the first murder and the 4 words answer, the most defiant thing anyone has ever said to God. God asked Cain where his brother was, and Cain said, "Am I my brother's keeper?" But here is what I need you to understand before we begin. Cain was not a monster. He was a human being who had a feeling that every person watching this has had. Jealousy, rejection, the burning of watching someone else receive what you wanted. And before he did what he did, God warned him, directly, by name. Sin is crouching at your door. You must rule over it. He went to the field anyway, and then, after the murder, God did something that nobody in 3,000 years has adequately explained. He put a mark on Cain, not as a punishment, not as a curse, as protection. The God who just watched the first murder in human history immediately protected the murderer. The mark of Cain is mercy, and that changes everything about what this story is actually saying. And one more thing before we begin. The Quran, in the context of this story, says something I cannot stop thinking about. Whoever kills one person, it is as if he has killed all of mankind. And whoever saves one person, it is as if he has saved all of mankind. All of mankind, in one person. The first murder teaching the most important lesson about what a single life is worth. That lesson is what tonight is about. Now, find a comfortable position, a really comfortable one. Go ahead and like the video, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is. I read every single one. We are going to start not in the field, but before it, with the world Cain and Abel were born into, and the question that runs through every chapter tonight. At what point does a feeling become a choice? And at what point does a choice become something that cannot be undone? Very, very slowly. Let's begin. Cain and Abel were the first human beings ever born, not made from clay, not breathed into existence by the direct hand of God. Born from a mother, in pain, the text tells us, in the pain that the judgment in the garden had promised. The first birth in human history, already carrying the weight of what had been lost. And Eve, holding her firstborn, said something that tells you everything about what she was feeling in that moment. I have acquired a man with the help of the Lord. With the help of the Lord? Even here, even outside the garden, even in the pain of the first birth, the acknowledgement that God had not disappeared, that the guidance promised in the exile was present, even in this. The first mother holding the first child and saying, God was here. The shadow. But let's be honest about the world that Cain and Abel were born into. Their parents had lost everything. Not in the abstract, not as a theological concept, in the most direct, most personal, most irreversible sense. They had lived in the presence of God immediately, walking together in the garden, in the cool of the evening, and that was gone. They had lived in a world where every need was provided without effort, and that was gone. They had lived without pain, without labour, without death, without any of the weight that the world outside the garden required of them every single day, and that was gone. And their children grew up in the shadow of it, not knowing the garden, but knowing that their parents had known it, growing up in the presence of a grief they had not caused and could not fix. What did Adam tell them? This is one of the questions the story leaves open that I find most fascinating. Did he tell them about the garden, about the trees and the rivers and the presence of God, warm and immediate, the way sunlight is warm? Did he describe what it felt like to walk with God in the cool of the evening before everything changed? Did Eve tell them about the serpent, about the conversation and the fruit and the moment the eyes were opened? Or was it too painful to speak about directly? Did the children grow up knowing only that something had been lost without fully understanding what it was? The Islamic tradition holds that Adam, as the first prophet, taught his children about God, about the creation, about the fall and the repentance and the mercy that had been given alongside the exile. That Cain and Abel knew the story of where they came from and chose differently with that knowledge. The world they worked, because the world outside the garden required work. Real work, constant work. The ground cursed, producing thorns and thistles alongside what was edible. The labour of separating the useful from the harmful every single day. And into this world, two brothers divided the labour, the way humanity has always divided labour, according to temperament, according to ability, according to the particular calling of each person toward a different relationship with the earth. Cain became a farmer, a worker of the ground that had been cursed because of what his father did. Cain, working the very thing that bore the mark of the fall every single day. Abel became a shepherd, a keeper of flocks, moving with the animals across the landscape, less tied to the cursed ground, more mobile, more free in a certain sense than his brother. The parents watching because Adam and Eve were still here, still present, watching their children grow up in the world that the fall had made. What did they feel watching Cain work the ground that God had cursed in the judgment that Adam himself had brought on? Did he feel guilt watching his son labour in the consequence of his own choice? Did Eve watch Abel with his flocks and see in the movement of the animals something of the garden that she had known? The animals that Adam had named in those first extraordinary days, still here, still present, carrying in their existence a faint echo of what had been. The family, living in the complex, layered, unspoken weight of everything that had happened before the children were born. The first worship, because both brothers worshipped. This is important and often overlooked. Cain was not irreligious. He was not someone who had rejected God or turned away or refused to acknowledge the one who had made everything. He brought an offering. He participated in the religious life of his family. He did, outwardly, what was expected of him, which makes what followed more complicated, not less. Because the problem with Cain was not that he didn't worship. The problem was something much harder to see from the outside. Something that lived on the inside, in the heart, in the intention, in the difference between going through the motions and meaning them. The Islamic tradition on the family, the Quran, does not give us the same biographical detail as Genesis, but across the Hadith literature and the tafsir, the commentary tradition, a picture emerges of the family that adds layers to what Genesis alone provides. Adam, the first prophet, teaching his children how to pray, how to offer, how to live in relation to God in the world outside the garden. The family, not abandoned to figure it out alone, guided, as God had promised on the first night outside the gate. And within this family, the Islamic tradition holds that Cain and Abel were each paired with a twin sister born alongside them, and that the conflict between the brothers had roots that went deeper than an offering. Roots in a dispute about the sisters and who would marry whom, and the particular, very human, combustible mix of jealousy and desire, and the sense that the arrangement was unfair. The first family, because that is what this was. The first family in human history. 4 people, 5 people, however many children Adam and Eve had, trying to make something work in a world that had not been designed for ease. Learning, as all families learn, by doing. Making mistakes, as all families make mistakes. Carrying, as all families carry the weight of the generation before them into the lives of the generation after. And within that family, something was building, slowly, quietly, the way things always build before they break. A resentment, a comparison, a sense in Cain that the scales were not balanced the way they should be, that his brother somehow had what he didn't, that the favour was flowing in the wrong direction. The world they were born into was not easy. Nobody in the history of the world had it harder than this family. First generation outside the garden, no template, no precedent, no one who had done this before to learn from. And yet, within that difficulty, within that hardship, within the daily labour of the cursed ground, and the first winters, and the first hungers, and the first griefs, 2 brothers chose differently. One towards something, one away from it. And the difference between those 2 directions is what the rest of this story is about. The world they inherited was not their fault. What they did with it was. Let the world settle into the first evening of this story. The family, together. The fire burning. The ground that had been worked all day, resting. And 2 brothers, side by side, not yet knowing what was coming. Chapter 2 is waiting. The 2 brothers. Who Cain was, really. Who Abel was, really. The farmer and the shepherd. The firstborn and the second. And the question that runs underneath everything in their story. Why does the firstborn so often in this tradition lose the blessing to the younger? But only when you need it. The family is together. The fire is burning. The night is quiet. There is a pattern in this tradition that is impossible to ignore. The firstborn loses the blessing to the younger, again and again and again. Cain, the firstborn, loses to Abel. Ishmael, the firstborn of Abraham and Isaac. Esau, the firstborn of Isaac and Jacob. Reuben, the firstborn of Jacob and Joseph. The older passed over for the younger so consistently in this tradition that it cannot be accidental. The tradition is saying something deliberately through this pattern, that the blessing does not go where the world expects it to go, that the favour does not follow the natural hierarchy of birth order, of seniority, of who was there first, that something else determines where the favour falls. And the story of Cain and Abel is the first time the tradition makes this point. Cain, the firstborn. let's spend time with him. Really spend time with him. Because Cain deserves more than the reading he usually gets. The villain, the murderer, the one who is mentioned only as a warning about what not to be. Cain was the first child ever born, the first person to enter the world through birth rather than creation. He would have been, for however long before Abel arrived, the centre of everything. The only child of the only parents on earth. The one on whom all attention, all love, all expectation was focused. And then Abel arrived, and the attention divided, as it always divides when a second child arrives, as it has divided in every family since. Cain, the farmer, the worker of the ground, the one who chose the hardest relationship with the earth. Farming in the ancient world was not a gentle occupation. It was total, seasonal, the whole year organised around the demands of the ground. Planting, tending, harvesting, protecting the crop from everything that wanted to take it. And then starting again. Every year, the same work, the same ground, the same cursed earth that his father had been told would resist him all the days of his life. Cain chose to work the most resistant thing in his world, every day, which tells you something about his character before the story turns dark. He was not lazy. He was not careless. He was someone who committed himself completely to the hardest work available. Abel, the younger, the shepherd, the one who kept flocks. Abel, in the biblical account, is almost entirely defined by his death. He speaks no words in the text. He makes no argument. He offers no defense when his brother's anger turns toward him. He is present, and then he is not. And yet, everything we are told about Abel suggests a person of genuine quality. The Quran gives him a voice in a passage that is one of the most moving in the entire story. A moment where Abel, seeing what his brother intended, said something that tells you everything about who he was. We will come to that in chapter 6. But know, for now, that Abel was not simply a passive victim. He was a person who had made choices of his own that defined him as clearly as Cain's choices defined him. The difference between them, because the difference between Cain and Abel was not as simple as good and evil. Not one was righteous and one was wicked from the beginning. They were brothers, from the same parents, with the same inheritance, the same knowledge of God, the same understanding of what had been lost and what had been promised. The difference was interior, in the heart, in the orientation of the self toward God and toward others. Abel, it seems, had found a way to live outside the garden that was genuinely oriented outward, toward God, toward his work, toward the offering he would bring. Cain had found a way to live that was oriented inward, toward himself, toward his own assessment of what was fair, toward the comparison between what he had and what Abel had, toward the question that is, perhaps, the most dangerous question a person can ask. Why him and not me? The Islamic tradition on their characters, the Hadith literature, and the tafsir give us more texture than the biblical account alone. Cain, in the Islamic tradition, is described as someone whose worship had become transactional, who gave, expecting a return, who offered, calculating what the offering would bring him. The religion of a person who had learned the external forms without internalizing the spirit. Abel, by contrast, is described as someone whose worship was genuine, who gave because he wanted to give, who offered from the best of what he had, not the surplus, not the remainder, the best. The religion of a person who understood that the offering was not about what you received in return. Two brothers, same family, same teaching, same God, different hearts. The firstborn and the blessing. Let's come back to the pattern we started with. Why does the firstborn lose the blessing so consistently in this tradition? The rabbis have reflected on this for centuries, and one answer that I find most compelling is this. The firstborn in the ancient world expected the blessing, assumed it, felt entitled to it by virtue of being first. The blessing was supposed to flow automatically through birth order, through natural hierarchy, through the way things were done. And the tradition, again and again, disrupts this, says, no, the blessing does not go to the one who expects it. It goes to the one who earns it. Not through work alone, through the orientation of the heart, through the genuine, humble, unassuming giving of what you have to God without calculating what you will get back. The comparison, because here is the thing about Cain that makes him so recognizable. He was not comparing himself to some abstract standard. He was comparing himself to his brother, the person right beside him, the person he had grown up with, the person who shared his parents, his home, his world, his God, and who, somehow, seemed to have something that Cain didn't. Not wealth, not power, not any of the things that people usually compare. Favour. The sense that God looked at Abel differently than he looked at Cain. That the relationship between Abel and God had a quality that Cain's relationship didn't have. And that this was unfair. Which is, perhaps, the most human feeling in the entire story. Not the murder. This. The comparison. The sense that the distribution of divine favour was not balanced the way it should be. What Cain didn't understand. And here is the thing that the story is trying very gently to say about Cain's comparison. The favour that Abel had was not given to Abel. It was grown by Abel from the inside, through the orientation of his heart toward God rather than toward himself, through the genuine giving of the best rather than the calculating giving of the surplus. Abel was not favoured because God liked him more. Abel was favoured because Abel had made himself the kind of person whose offering God could receive. The door that Cain thought was closed to him was open, always open, He just hadn't walked through it. And God was about to tell him exactly that. Two brothers, same world, same God, different hearts, and the offering coming. Let the morning settle into the day. Cain in the fields, Abel with his flocks. Two brothers working in the same world with different hearts, moving toward the moment that will reveal what was already there. Chapter 3 is waiting. The offering. What each brother brought. Why God accepted one and not the other. The three traditions on what made the difference. And the answer that changes everything about how you read not just this story, but every story about worship and giving and what God actually wants from us, but only when you need it. The brothers are working. The morning is quiet. The offering is coming. God rejected Cain's offering, not Cain, his offering. This distinction is everything. The text does not say God rejected Cain. It says God did not look with favour on Cain and his offering. The offering and the offerer inseparable in the assessment. But the rejection was not of the person. It was of what the person had brought and how and why. Which means the door was still open, still available, still accessible to Cain if he understood what the rejection was actually saying. What each brother brought, the biblical account is specific. Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil. Abel brought fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. Two details that scholars have examined for 3,000 years. Some of the fruits, fat portions from the firstborn. Some versus firstborn. The surplus versus the best. The remainder versus the first and finest. Not everything turns on this distinction, but the distinction is there in the text deliberately. Whatever Cain brought, it was not described as his best. Whatever Abel brought was explicitly his first, his finest. The fat portions, the choice cuts of the firstborn of his flock. Why does it matter what you bring? This is the question underneath the offering that the story is really asking. In the ancient world, an offering was not a transaction. Not, I give you this and you give me that. An offering was an expression of what you believed about the one you were offering to. If you brought your best, you were saying, the one I am bringing this to is worth my best, worth more than my surplus, worth the firstborn, the finest, the thing that cost me something to give. If you brought some of what you had, the remainder after you had taken what you needed, you were saying something different, something about what God was worth in your assessment, something about the priority God held in your life. The three traditions on what made the difference, because the scholars from all three traditions have not settled on a single explanation, and the variety of their answers is itself illuminating. The first answer, the most common, is sincerity. Abel brought his offering with a pure heart, with genuine devotion, with the orientation outward toward God, rather than inward toward himself. Cain brought his offering going through the motions, doing the external thing without the internal reality that gives the external thing its meaning. The offering rejected, not because of what it was, but because of the heart behind it. The second answer is quality. Abel brought the best, the firstborn, the fat portions, the most valuable from the finest of his flock. Cain brought some, not the best, not the first, some. The Jewish tradition in the Midrash is particularly pointed about this. Cain, the rabbis suggest, brought the flaxseed after he had already taken the good linen for himself. The leftovers, the remainder, the offering from which everything valuable had already been extracted, which is, if accurate, not an offering at all. It is disposal dressed up as devotion. The third answer is the most interesting, and the one that I think changes how you read not just this story, but the entire tradition. The offering was not the problem. The problem was what came before the offering, what Cain had already decided about God before he ever laid anything on the altar. The Islamic scholars are particularly helpful here. The offering, they argue, revealed a heart that had already made God secondary, that had already organized itself around the self rather than around God, that had already answered for itself the question of what God was worth, and had answered smaller than the truth. The offering was the visible expression of an invisible orientation. The fruit of the ground, after the good had been taken, was simply the outward sign of an inward arrangement that had been in place long before the altar was built. How God responded. The text is brief and significant. The Lord looked with favour on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favour. Looked with favour. The image of God's face turning towards someone with warmth, with welcome, with the particular quality of divine attention that feels like being fully seen, fully received. And on Cain and his offering, that face did not turn. Not with anger, not with rejection of the person, simply the absence of the favour that Abel received. The difference between being seen and not being seen by the one whose seeing matters most. What Cain felt. And Cain was very angry, and his face fell. His face fell. The image of someone whose expression changes in the moment of rejection. The particular physical expression of disappointment, of hurt, of the burning that comes when you expected something and did not receive it. Cain was angry, which is human, which is understandable, which is, if we are being honest, exactly what most of us would feel in that moment. You offered something. It was not received. The other person's was. The anger is not the problem. The anger is the moment when the door is most clearly still open. Because God, seeing the anger, immediately spoke to Cain. Not to Abel, to Cain. The one whose offering had been rejected was the one God turned toward first. God's question. Why are you angry? God asked Cain. Why has your face fallen? Two questions. Not, you did something wrong. Not, your offering was insufficient. Why are you angry? Why has your face fallen? The questions that invited Cain to examine what was happening inside him, to locate the source of the anger, to understand what the anger was really about. And then, before Cain could answer, God said something that is, perhaps, the most important thing God says to any individual in the entire Old Testament. If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? If you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? Let's stay with this for a moment. God, who had just not looked with favour on Cain's offering, turned to Cain and said, "The acceptance you want is available. It is not closed to you. It is not given to Abel and withheld from you arbitrarily. It follows from something that you can do. If you do what is right, you will be accepted. The offer was completely explicit. The door was not just open, it was pointed at. The path from where Cain was to where he wanted to be was described in one sentence. Do what is right, and you will be accepted. This was God's mercy before the murder, the intervention before the catastrophe, the hand extended toward the one who was angry and about to make a terrible choice. Sin crouching at the door, and then the warning. The most vivid, most urgent, most cinematically precise description of temptation in the entire Old Testament. Sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. Crouching, like an animal, waiting outside a door for the moment when it opens. Not inside yet, not having you yet. Crouching, waiting, desiring, but not yet having. The door between Cain and the catastrophe was still closed. The sin was crouching outside it. Not inside, outside. And Cain had the ability, the text is explicit, to keep it there. You must rule over it. Not you cannot resist it. Not it is inevitable. You must rule over it. The capacity to choose differently, explicitly affirmed by God himself in the moment before the choice. What Cain did with the warning. The text does not record Cain's response to God's words. He did not say, "Thank you, I will try." He did not say, "I understand what I need to do." He did not say anything. At least, nothing that the text preserved. What the text records is what happened next. Cain said to Abel his brother, "Let us go out to the field." And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Between the warning and the murder, the text gives us one sentence. Let us go out to the field. An invitation. An ordinary sounding sentence from a brother to a brother. That was not ordinary at all. The offering was a mirror. It showed Cain what was already inside him. And instead of looking honestly at what the mirror showed, he turned away from it, toward the field, toward his brother, toward the thing that the crouching sin had been waiting to suggest. The door was open. The path was described. The warning was given. And he walked toward the field anyway. Let the altar settle into silence. The offering received and not received. The warning given. The door still open. And Cain walking toward the field. Chapter 4 is waiting. The anger. What Cain did with the feeling after the warning. The building inside him of something that had been crouching at the door for longer than the offering. And the moment when the door finally opened. But only when you need it. The altar is behind him. The warning has been given. The field is ahead. Every person watching this has felt what Cain felt. Not the murder. Before the murder. The burning of watching someone else receive what you wanted. The particular, quiet, devastating feeling that the favour went to the wrong person. That feeling is not unique to Cain. It is, possibly, the most universal feeling in the human race. The question that this chapter is asking is not, why did Cain feel it? The question is, what did he do with it after God told him exactly what to do? Because anger is not in itself wrong. Anger is information. It is the signal that something in your experience of the world does not match your expectation of it. Something you believed should happen didn't. Something you believed you deserved was not given. Something you believed was fair turned out to be otherwise. Cain was angry. His face fell. Both of these are human responses to rejection. Both of these are understandable. Both of these are things that any person watching this has felt. The question the story is asking is not, why was Cain angry? The question is what Cain did with the anger after God told him exactly what to do with it. God's response to the anger. Because here is what is extraordinary about this moment in the story. God did not ignore the anger. He did not dismiss it. He did not say, "Your anger is wrong, stop feeling it." He asked about it. "Why are you angry? Why has your face fallen?" Two questions that took Cain's anger seriously, that treated the anger as something worth examining, that invited Cain into a conversation about what was happening inside him. Not, "Stop being angry." Why are you angry? This is one of the most compassionate moments in the entire story. God, who had just not looked with favour on Cain's offering, immediately turned toward Cain's pain and asked about it. The rejection of the offering did not mean rejection of the person. The door was still open. The conversation was still happening. God was still talking to Cain. What the anger was really about. Because Cain's anger on the surface was about the offering. My offering was rejected. Abel's was accepted. That is not fair. That is the injury. That is what the anger seems to be about. But underneath the offering, underneath the rejection, underneath the immediate experience of being passed over, the anger was about something older, deeper. Something that had been building, probably for a long time, before the altar, before the offering, before the day when God's face turned away. The anger was about comparison. The deep, corrosive, ongoing comparison between himself and his brother, between what he had and what Abel had, between how God seemed to see Abel and how God seemed to see him. The sense that the scales had always been tilted, and the offering had simply confirmed it. The danger of comparison. Because comparison is, perhaps, the most dangerous spiritual condition a person can be in. Not because wanting good things is wrong, not because noticing that others have what you don't is wrong, but because comparison, when it takes root, reorients everything. It takes your eyes off what you have and fixes them on what someone else has. It takes your attention off your own path and fixes it on someone else's. It replaces gratitude with grievance, contentment with resentment. The simple act of being present in your own life, with the exhausting, consuming, never satisfied work of measuring your life against someone else's. Cain was a farmer. He worked the ground. He produced. He provided. His life had real value, real dignity, real meaning. But he could not see it because he was looking at Abel. The Islamic understanding of Cain's anger. The Islamic scholars and the Hadith literature add a layer to the understanding of Cain's anger that the biblical account does not include. The conflict between Cain and Abel had a specific, personal, deeply human dimension beyond the offering. The dispute over the twin sisters. The arrangement that Adam had made for his children's marriages that Cain felt had disadvantaged him. That he, the firstborn, had been given the less favoured arrangement, while Abel, the younger, had received what Cain wanted. Which means the anger over the offering was not the beginning. It was the culmination. The final confirmation of a pattern that Cain believed had been running against him for his entire life. The offering was the last straw, not the only straw. The anger had been accumulating for years before it found its terrible expression. What God said about the anger. And here is where God's response becomes one of the most important things ever said about the human condition. If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? Read that again. If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? God, in this sentence, was telling Cain that the acceptance he wanted was not withheld from him, not given to Abel and denied to him arbitrarily, not the result of favouritism or unfairness or the tilted scales that Cain believed were working against him. The acceptance followed from something that Cain could do, something entirely within his control. The same path that Abel had walked was available to Cain. The same orientation of the heart, the same genuine giving, the same looking outward toward God rather than inward toward the self was available to him. Right now, in this moment, after the rejection, the door was still open. What Cain did with the offer, this is the most important moment in the chapter. God had said explicitly, the door is open. The acceptance is available. If you do what is right, you will be accepted. And Cain had a choice. He could have said, I hear you. I understand. I will look at what I am bringing and why I am bringing it, and I will address what the rejection is telling me about myself. Or he could turn away from the examination, away from the inward look that God was inviting, towards something external, toward the person whose offering had been accepted, toward the brother who seemed to have what he didn't, toward the field. The anger left unexamined does not stay as anger. Anger unaddressed does not simply dissipate. It transforms into something heavier, darker, more purposeful, into the thing that was crouching at the door. The transformation of anger, because this is what the story is documenting with extraordinary psychological precision. Anger, unexamined, becomes resentment. Resentment, fed, becomes bitterness. Bitterness, focused on a specific person, becomes hatred. Hatred, given time and the right opportunity, becomes what happened in the field. Not in one moment, not in a flash of uncontrollable rage that nobody could have predicted. In a sequence, a slow, deliberate, step-by-step sequence of choices, each one moving further from the door that God had pointed at, and closer to the field where the crouching sin was waiting. The murder was not the beginning. The murder was the end of a long process that began much earlier, with a comparison, with a resentment, with an anger that was not addressed when it should have been. The warning revisited. Sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you. but you must rule over it. Let's sit with this image one more time, because it is the most important image in the chapter. The sin was not inside Cain at this point. It was crouching outside the door, still outside, still waiting, still not yet having him, which means the capacity to not let it in was still present. The ability to rule over it was still available. The door was still in Cain's control. You must rule over it. Not you might manage to resist it. Not it will be very difficult, but perhaps possible. You must rule over it. The imperative of someone who knew that the capacity was there, who would not have given the command if the command were impossible to follow. What this means for us, because this story is not only about Cain, it is about every person who has ever felt the particular burning of comparison. Every person who has watched someone else receive what they wanted and felt the slow, corrosive darkening of something inside them. Every person who has been angry and chosen not to examine the anger, but to feed it. The story is asking, in the most direct possible way, what are you doing with what is crouching at your door? Not, do you have something crouching there? Everyone does. Not, is the crouching a failure? The crouching is simply what it is to be human. What are you doing with it? Are you examining it? Are you addressing it? Are you walking through the door that God pointed at? Or are you walking toward the field? The warning was given. The door was pointed at. The anger was not addressed. And the field was getting closer. Let the day settle into evening. Cain still in the fields. The anger still in him, unexamined, untreated, transforming slowly into something that was crouching and waiting and growing more purposeful with every passing hour. Chapter 5 is waiting. The warning. Not just God's warning to Cain, but everything the warning contains. What sin crouching at the door actually means. What ruling over it actually requires. And the question that sits underneath everything in this chapter. At what point does a feeling become a choice? And at what point does a choice become the thing that cannot be undone? But only when you need it. The evening is quiet. The fields are still. The door is still open. God warned Cain before the murder, directly, personally, by name. Not a general warning about the dangers of anger. Not a principle handed down for people to apply as they see fit. A specific, direct, personal intervention in the life of one person who was moving in a dangerous direction. God saw what was building in Cain before Cain had acted on it. He saw the anger. He saw the comparison. He saw the resentment transforming slowly into something darker. And he intervened. Which means the murder did not happen without warning. It did not happen in a moment of blind, uncontrollable rage that nobody could have predicted. It happened after the warning, after the door was explicitly pointed at and left open. After God himself told Cain exactly what was crouching at his door and exactly what to do about it. Sin is crouching at your door. Let's stay with this image for the entire chapter, because this image is perhaps the most vivid, most precise, most psychologically accurate description of temptation in the entire Old Testament. Sin, crouching, like an animal, patient, still, low to the ground, waiting, with the particular patience of something that knows it does not need to rush, that knows the door will open eventually, that has learned from long experience that if it waits long enough and quietly enough, the person on the other side of the door will open it themselves. Not forcing entry, not breaking through, crouching, waiting, desiring, outside the door. This is the detail that changes everything about how you read this image. Sin is crouching at your door, not inside your house, not already in the room with you, outside, at the door, on the threshold, still on the other side of something that Cain still controlled. The door was Cain's. The house was Cain's. The decision about whether the door opened or stayed closed was Cain's. The sin, however powerful, however patient, however much it desired to have him, could not come in unless Cain let it. Which means, at the moment God gave this warning, Cain was still in control, still capable, still free. The catastrophe had not yet happened. The door was still his to keep closed. It desires to have you. 3 words that deserve more attention than they usually receive. It desires to have you. Not it desires to make you do something. Not it desires to make you sin once. To have you. Complete possession. Total occupation. The ambition of the crouching thing was not a single act. It was the person. All of the person. The whole life reoriented around the thing that had crept in through the open door. This is what happens when a sin is let in. It does not stay in one room. It does not remain the small, manageable thing it seemed when you opened the door. It expands. It occupies. It has you in ways you did not anticipate when you made the first small choice to let it cross the threshold. But you must rule over it, and then the counterweight to everything that the warning had just described. But you must rule over it. 4 words that contain an entire theology of human freedom. Must. Not you might be able to, not perhaps with great effort you could manage. Must. The imperative of someone who was not describing an impossibility, who would not have given the command if the command could not be followed, who knew that the capacity was there in Cain to do what was being asked. Rule over it, not suppress it, not pretend it isn't there, not white-knuckle your way through the temptation and hope for the best. Rule over it. The language of authority, of mastery, of a person who stands over the crouching thing and says, not today, not through this door, not into this house. what ruling over it actually requires. Because, but you must rule over it, sounds, in theory, simple. In practice, it is one of the hardest things a human being can do. To rule over the crouching thing requires, first, acknowledging that it is there, not pretending that the anger isn't anger, not telling yourself that the comparison is justified, not feeding the resentment with fresh grievances every time it starts to fade. It requires looking honestly at what is crouching at the door, naming it, understanding where it came from, and then making the deliberate, costly, daily choice not to open the door. For Cain, this would have meant looking honestly at the comparison and asking, is this comparison telling me something true about God and about Abel, or is it telling me something about myself that I need to address? The Islamic understanding of the warning. The Islamic tradition takes the warning one step further in a direction that I find particularly powerful. The Quran, in the story of Cain and Abel, does not record God's warning to Cain in the same way as Genesis, but it records something that happens after the murder that illuminates what the warning was really about. Abel, in the Quranic account, saw what his brother intended. He saw the anger building. He saw the direction it was taking. And he said to Cain something that is one of the most remarkable things said by any person to any person in any religious text. If you raise your hand to kill me, I will not raise my hand to kill you. I fear God, the Lord of the worlds. If you raise your hand to kill me, I will not raise my hand to kill you. Let's sit with this. Abel, who could see what was coming, who understood what his brother intended, said, I will not fight back. Not, I cannot fight back. I will not. A choice. A deliberate, freely made, extraordinarily costly choice. To not let what was crouching at his own door, the instinct of self-preservation, the understandable, entirely human response of raising your hand when someone raises theirs, to not let that in, to keep his own door closed, even as Cain's was opening. Abel, ruling over what was crouching at his door, in the hardest possible circumstance, at the highest possible cost. Two brothers, two doors, two choices. This is, perhaps, the deepest structure of the entire story. Not good versus evil, simply, not one righteous, one wicked from the beginning. Two human beings, each with something crouching at their door, each with a choice about whether to open it or keep it closed. Cain opened his. Abel kept his closed. And the difference between those two choices is the difference between everything in this story. Which means the story is not asking, are you Cain or Abel? The story is asking something much more immediate. What is crouching at your door right now? And what are you doing with it? The warning and what it cost to ignore it. Because the warning was not just a kindness from God to Cain. It was, in some ways, the last mercy before the catastrophe. The last open door before the field. The last moment when the direction of the story could have changed. When Cain, could have turned back toward the altar, back toward the conversation, back toward the God who was still talking to him, still asking, "Why are you angry?" Still pointing at the door that was still open. And Cain did not turn back. He took the warning and left it unanswered, unacted on. The most expensive, unanswered warning in human history. Because what it cost to ignore it was not just his own life, his own integrity, his own relationship with God. It cost Abel everything. What the warning means for us. Because the warning God gave Cain was not only for Cain. It is for every person who has ever felt something crouching at their door. Every person who has recognized the early stages of something building inside them and chosen not to address it, not to examine it, not to bring it to the one who could help them deal with it. The warning is still being given, not in a voice from outside, in the discomfort that comes when something is building that should not be building, in the unease that arrives when you have been feeding something that deserves to starve, in the question that surfaces in the quiet moments when you are honest with yourself. Is this where I want this to go? The warning is the mercy before the catastrophe. It is always given before the field. The question is whether we hear it. The warning was given. The door was pointed at. The capacity was there. And Cain walked toward the field anyway. Let the warning settle into the silence it was met with. The field ahead. The door behind. The crouching thing rising now, following as the distance between Cain and the warning grew. Chapter 6 is waiting. The field. What happened there? The moment that cannot be undone. And the detail that the Islamic tradition gives us that the Bible does not. The crow that appeared after the murder and showed Cain something he did not know how to do. And what Cain said when he saw it, that is one of the most heartbreaking lines in the entire story. But only when you need it. The field is ahead. The warning is behind. And the thing that was crouching is standing now. Let us go out to the field. 5 words. The most ordinary sounding, most devastating 5 words in the chapter. An invitation. From a brother to a brother. The kind of sentence that had probably been said 100 times before between these two. Let us go out to the field. Come with me. Walk with me. The language of brothers, a familiarity, of a relationship built across years, of shared work, shared meals, shared mornings in the world, outside the garden. And Abel went. Because why wouldn't he? It was his brother. It was the field. It was an ordinary invitation on an ordinary day. He did not know that the warning had been given and ignored. He did not know that the door had been walked past. He did not know that the crouching thing was no longer crouching. What happened in the field? The biblical account is brief. Almost unbearably brief. Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. 9 words. 9 words for the first murder in human history. No description of how. No description of why, beyond what has already been told. No record of what was said in the moments before. No account of what Cain felt as it happened. Just 9 words. Cain rose up against his brother and killed him. The brevity is itself significant. The text does not dwell, does not describe with any satisfaction or drama or detail what took place, as if the act itself was so far outside the order of things, so far from anything the world had been made for, that the text could not quite bring itself to describe it. What Abel said before, because the Quran gives Abel a voice in this moment that the Bible does not. Abel, who could see what his brother intended, spoke. And what he said is one of the most remarkable things said by any person to any person in any religious text in human history. If you raise your hand to kill me, I will not raise my hand to kill you. Indeed, I fear God, the Lord of the worlds. I want you to leave with my sin and your sin, and you will be among the companions of the fire. And that is the recompense of the wrongdoers. Let's stay with the first part for a moment. If you raise your hand to kill me, I will not raise my hand to kill you. Not, I cannot fight back. Not, I am too afraid to fight back. I will not. A choice. A deliberate, conscious, extraordinary choice, made in the most extreme possible circumstance. I fear God. Those 3 words are the explanation for everything Abel chose. Not, I am stronger than fear. Not, I have risen above the instinct of self-preservation. I fear God. The fear of God as the thing that ordered everything else, that placed even the instinct to survive beneath the higher authority of what God required, that said, even here, even now, even facing this, what matters most is not my survival. It is what God would have me do. Abel ruling over what was crouching at his own door. The most primal, most understandable, most entirely human crouching thing. The desire to live, kept outside by 3 words. I fear God. The crow, and then the detail that the Islamic tradition gives us that the Bible does not. The detail that is, perhaps, the most human moment in the entire story. After Cain killed Abel, he stood over the body and did not know what to do. Nobody had ever died before. Nobody had ever been buried before. There was no template, no precedent, no one who had done this before him, from whom he could learn. The first murderer stood over the first body in human history, completely at a loss, not knowing what came next, not knowing what to do with the brother who was no longer his brother in the way he had always been. And then God sent a crow. The crow scratching the earth. The Quran tells us, so God sent a crow scratching the ground to show him how to hide the disgrace of his brother. A crow scratching the earth beside another dead crow, digging, covering, burying. The most ordinary behaviour of the most ordinary bird, becoming the first lesson in burial in human history. God, who had watched what Cain had done in the field, sent a bird to show him how to deal with the consequence, not abandoning him even now, not leaving him to stand indefinitely over the body of his brother without any way to do what needed doing. Even in this, the mercy present. Even here, the guidance still arriving. What Cain said. And then, Cain said something, watching the crow, that is one of the most heartbreaking lines in the entire story. "Woe to me," he said. "Am I not able to be like this crow and hide the nakedness of my brother?" And he became of the regretful. Am I not able to be like this crow, the first murderer humbled by a bird, comparing himself not to Abel, not to God, not to any human standard, to a crow, and finding himself wanting. The regret was real. The Quran says he became of the regretful. Not he felt a passing sadness. He became of the regretful. The regret defining him in this moment as completely as the murder had defined him. But the regret came after the field, after the 9 words, after the irreversible thing had been done. The regret that came too late, because this is the part of Cain's story that most people miss. Cain, after the murder, was not without feeling. He was not cold, unmoved, indifferent to what he had done. He regretted. He became of the regretful. But the regret came too late to undo what the anger had done. The warning had been given before the field. The door had been pointed at before the field. The capacity to choose differently had been explicitly affirmed before the field. And the regret arrived after, which is the most painful lesson in the chapter. That regret, however genuine, however deep, cannot undo what was done before it arrived. That the time to address what is crouching at the door is before, not after, it crosses the threshold. The first death. Because let's acknowledge what had just happened in the field. Abel was the first human being to die. The first person in all of human history to experience the thing that God had warned about in the garden. In the day you eat of it, you will surely die. And now, death had arrived. Not to the ones who had eaten the fruit, to their son, the second generation, the one who had done nothing to deserve it. The first death was not a natural death. The first death was a murder, which is, perhaps, the most devastating commentary on what the fall had introduced into the world. Death, when it arrived as violence, as the act of one person against another, as the thing that the crouching sin produces when it is let in and given full expression. The blood And then God, asking. The ground, the text tells us, cried out. Abel's blood crying from the ground to God. The earth itself, witness to what had happened in the field. The ground that Cain had worked every day of his life, that knew the weight of his footsteps, now holding the blood of his brother. The blood of your brother, God said, is crying out to me from the ground. The blood crying. The image of something so wrong, so far outside the order of things that the earth itself could not be silent about it, could not absorb it without response, could not hold it without crying out to the one who had made everything and who needed to know what had happened in his world. The field is quiet now. The crow has finished its work. The ground holding what it holds. And God asking the question that was never about information. Let the field settle into silence. The ground holding what it holds. The crow gone. The regret in Cain real and too late. And the question coming from the one who already knew the answer. Chapter 7 is waiting. Where is your brother? The question God asked into the silence of the field. And Cain's answer, the 4 words that are, perhaps, the most defiant thing anyone has ever said to God in the history of the world. Am I my brother's keeper? But only when you need it. The field is quiet. The blood is in the ground. The question is coming. Where is your brother? 3 words, the most important 3 words in the chapter. Not, what have you done? Not, I saw what happened in the field. Not, the consequence is coming. Where is your brother? The same kind of question as the one in the garden. Where are you? God had asked Adam, hiding behind the trees. Not for information, for Adam. Where is your brother? God asked Cain, standing in the field. Not for information, for Cain. The question that invited Cain to locate himself in relation to what had just happened, to say out loud what he had done, to stand in the truth of the field and acknowledge it, to do what Adam had eventually done in the garden. Come out. Stop hiding. Tell me where you are. Why ask what you already know? Because this is the question that sits underneath God's question. God knew where Abel was. God had heard the blood crying from the ground. God had seen what happened in the field. Every detail, every moment, every step of the sequence from the rejected offering to the 9 words was known completely by the one asking the question. And yet he asked, "Where is your brother?" Because the question was not about Abel. The question was about Cain. About what Cain would do with the question. Whether he would answer honestly. Whether, even now, after the field, after the blood, after the crow and the regret, he would turn toward the truth or away from it. The door was still open, even now, even here. The invitation still present in the question. Cain's answer, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? 4 words, after the first two. 4 words that are, perhaps, the most defiant thing anyone has ever said to God in the history of recorded religion. I do not know where my brother is. The lie, so direct, so immediate, so completely, without hesitation, that it takes a moment to absorb. He had just buried him. He knew exactly where his brother was. And he said, "I do not know." But it is the second part that is really extraordinary. Am I my brother's keeper? Not just, "I don't know," but, "Why are you asking me? Is it my job to keep track of him? Am I responsible for my brother? Am I my brother's keeper?" Let's stay with this for a moment, because this question, which Cain threw at God as a deflection, has become, in the centuries since, one of the most important questions in the entire tradition. Am I my brother's keeper? The answer that the story gives back is yes. Yes, you are. Not in the sense that you control every choice your brother makes. Not in the sense that you are responsible for every outcome in every life around you. But in the sense that what happens to the person beside you is not entirely none of your business. That the blood, when it cries from the ground, cries to someone. That the someone is not only God. That every person who walks past the field where the blood is crying carries some version of the answer to Cain's question inside them. The deflection and what it reveals, because Cain's answer is not just a lie and a deflection, it is a window into the interior of someone who had let the crouching thing all the way in. Adam, in the garden, had deflected too. "The woman you put here with me, she gave me the fruit." 2 deflections in 1 sentence, but Adam had at least stayed in the conversation, had answered, however imperfectly, had not thrown the question back at God. Cain threw the question back. Am I my brother's keeper? The deflection of someone who had gone further than Adam went, who had let in not just the eating of a fruit, but the taking of a life, and whose response to being asked about it was not shame, not acknowledgement, not the beginning of repentance, but a question thrown back into the face of the one asking. The contrast with the Quranic account, because the Quran gives us a different version of this moment that is worth sitting with. The Quran does not record Cain's deflection in the same way. What it records is the consequence, and within the consequence, something that the biblical account does not include. The sense that Cain, after the crow, after the burying, became of the regretful. That the deflection, if it happened, was not the whole story of what was in Cain at this moment. That underneath the defiance, the regret was real. That the question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" may have been what came out, but underneath it, something else was present. Something that knew exactly what it had done. God's response to the deflection, because God did not accept the deflection. He did not say, "Fair enough, you don't know." He did not let the question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" stand unanswered. He answered it with what he already knew, with what the ground had already told him. "What have you done? Listen, the voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." The consequence, specific and significant. The ground, which Cain had worked all his life, would no longer yield to him. The relationship between Cain and the earth, broken by what had happened in the field. The fugitive. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. This is, perhaps, the most precisely calibrated consequence in the story. Cain, whose entire identity was rooted in the ground, who had built his life around the work of the earth, who knew the soil, the seasons, the rhythm of planting and harvesting more intimately than anything else in his world, was told that the ground would no longer receive him, that the earth that he had worked every day of his life would be hostile to him now, that he would wander without root, without the thing that had defined him, the farmer without a farm, the worker of the ground rejected by the ground. Cain's response to the judgment, and then something unexpected. My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. My punishment is greater than I can bear. Not, I deserved this. Not, the judgment is just. My punishment is greater than I can bear. The cry of someone who recognized the weight of what the consequence meant, who understood that the wandering, the groundlessness, the hiddenness from the face of God was, in some ways, worse than death. And, from your face I shall be hidden. The most devastating line in Cain's response. Not, I will be punished. From your face I shall be hidden. The loss of the presence articulated by the one who had brought the loss on himself. The mercy in the judgment. And then, immediately, God responded to Cain's fear. Whoever kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him. The mark. We will spend all of chapter 8 on the mark, but note, for now, what prompted it. Not God's decision, imposed from above. Cain's fear. Whoever finds me will kill me. The cry of a person who was afraid, who was alone, who was going out into a world that knew what he had done. And God responding to the fear of the murderer with protection. Not because the murder was acceptable, but because the cycle of violence that the murder would have started if left unaddressed was something God would not allow to continue. Where is your brother? The question, not for information. The answer, deflection. The consequence, spoken. And the mark, already coming. Let the field settle into the evening. The judgment, spoken. The fear, real. The wandering, about to begin. And the mark, about to be given by a God who had just judged and was already protecting. Chapter 8 is waiting, the mark of Cain, the most misunderstood symbol in the Bible, used for centuries to justify slavery, racism, exclusion, the treatment of certain people as less than human. Every single one of those readings, wrong. The mark was protection, given by God to the first murderer, so that no one could harm him. Tonight, we are going to understand exactly what that means, but only when you need it. The field is quiet. The judgment has been spoken. The mark is coming. The mark of Cain is the most misunderstood symbol in the Bible. Not slightly misunderstood, catastrophically, weaponized, used for centuries by people who had read the text and drawn from it the precise opposite of what the text actually says. Used to justify slavery, used to justify racism, used to mark certain people as cursed, as less than human, as bearing on their bodies the sign of divine rejection. Every single one of those uses is wrong. Not partially wrong, not misapplied, wrong. The mark of Cain in the text was not a curse. It was not a brand. It was not a sign of rejection or diminishment or the marking of a person as less. The mark of Cain was protection, given by God to the first murderer, so that no one could harm him. What the text actually says. Let's go straight to the text. No interpretation yet, just what it says. And the Lord said to him, Therefore, whoever kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him. Lest any who found him should attack him. That is the reason for the mark. Not so everyone would know what he had done. Not so he would be identified as a murderer wherever he went. Not as a sign of divine punishment written on his body. Lest anyone should attack him. The mark was a shield, a protection, a divine guarantee that the first murder would not become the template for all murders that followed. Why protection? Because without the mark, what would have happened? Cain went out as a fugitive into a world that knew what he had done. Adam and Eve knew. Whatever other children they had knew. The generations that followed would know. And in the world, without law, without courts, without any mechanism for justice, beyond the personal, the familial, the tribal, the most natural response to the first murder would have been another murder. Someone avenging Abel. Someone deciding that what Cain had done required the same response from them. Blood for blood. Violence for violence. The oldest, most predictable, most human response to being wronged. The mark interrupted that. The mark said, This cycle ends here. With me, not with you. Vengeance is mine, not yours. Sevenfold. Whoever kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. 7. Not, I will be mildly displeased. Not, there will be some consequence. Sevenfold. The most emphatic, most serious, most unambiguous statement that the life of the first murderer was under divine protection. Which is, theologically, one of the most startling things God says in the entire Old Testament. Not, the life of the innocent is protected. The life of the guilty is protected. The life of the man who had just committed the first murder in human history was worth sevenfold protection from God. Not because what he did was acceptable. Not because the murder was overlooked. Because every human life, even the life of someone who had done the worst thing a human being had yet done, was still a human life. Still carrying the breath of God. Still worth protecting. What the mark was. The text does not tell us what the mark actually was. Not its nature, not its appearance, not where, on Cain's body it was placed, just that God put a mark on Cain, and that the mark served a protective purpose. The Jewish tradition has offered many suggestions. A letter from the divine name inscribed on his forehead, a horn grown from his head that marked him as different, as under divine protection, a dog sent to accompany him as a guardian, a sign in the sky that followed him wherever he went. The Islamic tradition holds most commonly that it was a mark on his forehead, visible, unmistakable, the sign that this person was not to be touched. None of these is in the text explicitly. What is in the text is the function, not the form, but the function. Protection. The historical misuse and why it matters. Because we cannot talk about the mark of Cain without talking about what was done with it. In the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, the mark of Cain was used as a theological justification for the enslavement of African people. The claim that dark skin was the mark of Cain, that the descendants of Cain were cursed and therefore could be enslaved, that the Bible itself authorized the treatment of certain human beings as less than human. This is one of the most catastrophic misreadings of a religious text in human history. Not a difference of interpretation, not a theological disagreement, a catastrophic misreading of a text that says plainly, clearly, unambiguously, the mark was protection, given by God to preserve the life of the person who bore it. The people who used the mark of Cain to justify slavery were not reading the Bible. They were using it. The mercy in the mark. Because let's name what the mark actually represents in the story. Cain had just committed the first murder. He had been warned and ignored the warning. He had been offered an open door and walked past it. He had lied to God directly. He had deflected with the most defiant question in the Old Testament. And God, having judged, having spoken the consequence, heard his fear. Whoever finds me will kill me. And responded to the fear of the murderer with a mark that said, "No one will kill you. I will not allow it." This is the mercy of the story. Not despite the judgment, inside it, woven through it. The same hands that spoke the consequence put the mark on Cain's body. The judgment and the protection inseparable, from the same God in the same moment. What the mark says about God. Because the mark is not just about Cain. It is about what kind of God this story is telling us about. A God who punishes but does not abandon, who judges but does not dispose of, who speaks the consequence and then, immediately, provides for the one who must live with the consequence. The same God who clothed Adam and Eve before sending them from the garden. The same God who sent guidance into the exile with them. The same God who accepted Adam's repentance completely, who taught him the words to pray back to God. The pattern is consistent across every story in this tradition. Judgment and mercy together. Consequence and provision together. Never one without the other. Never the door permanently closed. The Islamic understanding of the mark. The Islamic tradition approaches the mark through the lens of what the story is fundamentally about. The Quran does not describe the mark in detail, but the Islamic scholars have reflected on the principle that the mark represents: that human life is sacred, that the taking of a life is the gravest, most serious, most consequential act a human being can commit, and that, paradoxically, even the life of the one who had taken a life remained sacred. Whoever kills one person, it is as if he has killed all of mankind, and whoever saves one person, it is as if he has saved all of mankind. The mark, in the Islamic understanding, was God saving one person, Cain, the murderer, whose life remained worth saving, whose breath was still the breath of God, whose existence, however marked, however guilty, however wandering, still carried within it the original dignity of the creature made from clay and breath and the knowledge of all things. What the mark means for us. Because the mark is not only about Cain, it is about every person who has ever done something that they believed placed them beyond the reach of mercy. Every person who has carried something so heavy, so dark, so far outside what they believed about themselves, that they assumed the mark they bore was a curse, was the sign of permanent rejection, was the indication that the door to the presence they had lost was closed forever. The mark of Cain says no. The mark is not the curse. The mark is the protection. The thing you thought identified you as beyond mercy might be the very thing God put on you to protect you while you wander through the consequence of what you did toward whatever comes next. The mark given. Not a curse, protection. Not rejection, provision. And Cain, walking into the wandering, marked and protected at the same time. Let the mark settle into the silence of everything it means. The judgment spoken, the mercy given, the wandering beginning, and Cain moving out into the world, carrying both things at once: the consequence and the protection, the mark and the mercy. Chapter 9 is waiting, the wandering, the land of Nod, east of Eden, the city that Cain built and named after his son, the extraordinary continuation of a life that might have ended in the field, and the question that the wandering raises about what God's mercy actually means for the people who receive it. But only when you need it. The mark is given, the wandering is beginning, and Cain is still alive. Cain went out from the presence of the Lord. 6 words that are, perhaps, the saddest 6 words in the chapter. Not Cain was sent out. Not Cain was expelled. Cain went out. The verb, active, his. The movement, his own. From the presence of the Lord. The thing that Cain himself had said was the worst part. From your face I shall be hidden. The loss of the presence articulated by the one who had brought the loss on himself. And now, walking into it, the hiddenness beginning, the distance from the face of God growing with every step away from the field, away from the family, away from everything he had known. The land of Nod. And Cain settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Nod, the name in Hebrew from the root nud, meaning to wander, to be a fugitive, to move without rest, without route, without the particular security of a place that is yours. The land of Nod was not a place with a name before Cain arrived. It became the land of Nod because Cain, the wanderer, settled there. The place named for the condition of its first inhabitant. The wanderer giving his wandering to the land that received him. East of Eden. Always east in this tradition when someone moves away from the original. Adam and Eve exiled east of the garden. Cain settling east of Eden. The direction of the leaving always the same. East, away from, west, toward. What the wandering felt like. Because let's try to imagine what the wandering actually meant for Cain. He was a farmer, the worker of the ground, the person whose entire identity was rooted in the seasonal, the cyclical, the returning rhythm of the earth. Planting, tending, harvesting. The year organised around the demands of the soil. The life built in one place. From one place, around one place. And now the ground would not yield to him. The soil that he knew intimately, that he had worked every day of his life, was hostile to him now. The thing that had given him his purpose, his identity, his place in the world, was gone. The farmer without a farm. The worker of the ground with no ground to work. And yet he settled. The land of Nod, east of Eden, and Cain settled there. The wanderer settled. The fugitive found somewhere. Not the home he had known, not the ground he had worked, not the family he had left behind, but somewhere, a place in the world that received him, marked as he was, guilty as he was, wandering as he was. The mercy in the settling, easy to miss if you are not looking for it, but present. The world that God had made, still capable of receiving the one who had done the worst thing in it. He settled. And then he did something that nobody ever talks about when they talk about Cain. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. And he built a city, and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. Two things, a son and the city. The first murderer had a family, had a child, named him Enoch, meaning dedicated, or initiated, or beginning. The name of someone starting something new. The name of a father who looked at his son and saw not the end, but the beginning, and built a city, named it after his son. The first city in human history built by the first murderer, named after his child, not named after his crime, not named after the field, not named after the regret, or the wandering, or the mark, after his son, Enoch, dedicated, beginning, the city. Let's stay with this for a moment, because the building of the city is one of the most remarkable details in the entire story. God had told Cain, "You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." And Cain built a city, not as a defiance of the judgment, not as an attempt to undo what God had said, but as the act of someone who had received the mercy and was doing something with it, who had been given his life by the mark and was choosing to build from it, who had wandered to the land of Nod and decided that the wandering did not have to be the final word. The first city, built by the most unlikely builder in human history. The man whose hands had done the worst thing human hands had yet done, building something for his son to live in. The generations. Because after Cain, the text gives us a genealogy. The descendants of Cain, listed generation by generation. Enoch, the son, became the father of Irad. Irad, the father of Mehujael. Mehujael, the father of Methushael. Methushael, the father of Lamech. And Lamech took 2 wives, Ada and Zillah. And from Lamech came something extraordinary. From Ada, Jabal, who was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock, and his brother Jubal, who was the father of all those who play the lyre and pipe. And from Zillah, Tubal-Cain, who was the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. 3 things from the line of Cain: herding, music, metalwork. 3 of the foundations of human civilization, coming from the descendants of the first murderer. What does that mean? That the contributions of civilization came from the line of the murderer is not a small detail. It is, perhaps, the most honest thing the text says about humanity. That beauty and progress and the extraordinary things that human beings build and create and discover do not come only from the righteous, do not come only from the line of the faithful, the obedient, the ones whose offerings were accepted. They come from everywhere, from the marked and the wandering and the guilty and the ones who built cities in the land of Nod, because the mercy gave them a life to build with. Music coming from Cain's line, the thing that perhaps more than anything else expresses the inward life of the human being in sound. Coming from the family of the first murderer, which tells you something about the complexity of the human story that no simple reading can quite contain. Lamech. And then, in the line of Cain, a shadow. Lamech, 5 generations from Cain, said something to his wives that reveals what had happened to the mark in the generations since Cain. Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, wives of Lamech. Listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is 7-fold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. The mark that God gave Cain as protection, as the interruption of the cycle of violence, had been in the hands of his descendant 5 generations later, turned into a boast. The mercy weaponized, the protection claimed as license. If God protects Cain sevenfold, I will protect myself 77-fold. The thing given to stop the cycle, used to justify the cycle continuing, the wandering and what it meant. Because the wandering of Cain is not just his story, it is the story of every person who has ever carried the consequence of something they cannot undo. Every person who has wandered in the land of Nod, the land that is named for the wandering itself. Every person who has found themselves east of where they started, further from the presence than they ever intended to be, and had to decide what to do with the life that the mercy had left them with. Build a city, name it after your son, call it beginning. The wandering does not have to be the whole story. It can be the place where something starts, where the hands that did the worst thing begin to build something worth leaving behind. Cain, wandering, marked and protected, building in the land of Nod, naming it after his son, and the line continuing, carrying beauty and shadow, both, forward. Let the city settle into the evening, the building continuing, the line extending, the music beginning somewhere in the tents of Jubal, and Abel in the ground, still, his blood still crying, still asking to be remembered. Chapter 10 is waiting. Abel's blood, the righteous one, whose death, the Quran says, is as if all of mankind had been killed, whose life and whose death and whose refusal to raise his hand in return teach the most important lesson in the entire story about the value of a single human life. But only when you need it. The city is being built. The music is beginning. And Abel is waiting to be remembered. The blood crying. The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Abel never said a word in the Bible, not one. He is introduced as the younger brother. He tends his flocks. He brings an offering. His offering is accepted. He goes to the field with his brother, and he dies. Not one recorded word, not a protest, not a defense, not a single sentence that tells us what he thought about his brother, about his God. about the life he was living and the death that was coming. And yet, Abel, the silent one, is present in every chapter of this story, in the accepted offering, in the blood crying from the ground, in the question, "Where is your brother?" that God asked into the silence of the field, in the mark given because his blood demanded that the cycle not continue. Abel, silent in the text, speaking from the ground, louder than anything Cain said. Again, the blood crying. The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Let's stay with this image, because it is one of the most remarkable images in the entire Old Testament. Blood crying. Not the memory of Abel crying. Not Adam and Eve crying for their son. The blood itself crying from the ground to God. The image of something so fundamentally wrong, so far outside the order for which the world was made, that the earth itself could not absorb it silently, could not take it in the way it takes in rain, the way it takes in seed, without response, without crying out to the one who made everything and who needed to know what had been done in his world. The blood crying. The most powerful image in the story of what a human life is worth. That even after it is taken, it does not go silent. That it speaks. That it is heard. The Quranic verse. Because here is the most important thing the Islamic tradition contributes to the story of Abel. The Quran, in the context of this story, records a verse that I consider one of the most important things ever written about the value of a human life. Because of that, we decreed upon the children of Israel that whoever kills a soul, unless for a soul or for corruption done in the land, it is as if he had slain all of mankind. And whoever saves one, it is as if he had saved all of mankind. All of mankind, in one person. Every person who has ever lived, or will ever live, somehow present in the life of the one who stands before you. The death of Abel was not just the death of one person. It was, in the Quranic understanding, as if all of mankind had been killed. All of them, in one. The first murder, as vast in its significance as if everyone had been killed at once. Why all of mankind? Because every person who has ever lived was once one person, one individual, one life, with everything that a life contains. Parents who loved them, children who came from them, grandchildren who came from those children. The entire tree of descendants that one life would have produced, cut off at the root by the taking of that one life. Abel had no children. He died young in the field, before he had built anything, before he had passed on anything, before the tree of his descendants had produced a single branch. Every person who might have come from Abel died in the field with him. The world that his descendants might have built, gone with the 9 words in the field. All of mankind in one person, because one person contains all of them. And whoever saves one. The second half of the verse is as important as the first, and whoever saves one, it is as if he had saved all of mankind. The same logic in the opposite direction, the same all of mankind present in the one life saved. Every descendant, every relationship, every contribution that the saved life would go on to make, preserved in the act of saving one person, which is, perhaps, the most practical, most actionable, most immediately applicable verse in the entire story. You do not have to save all of mankind. You have to save one. And in the saving of one, all of mankind is present. The verse that the murder of Abel prompted is the verse that contains the antidote to everything the murder represents. The answer to the field is not another field. The answer to the blood crying from the ground is the hand extended toward one person who needed it. Abel in the Islamic tradition, because the Quran gives Abel a voice that the Bible does not. And it is, in the Islamic tradition, the most remarkable voice in the story. When Cain approached with his intention clear, Abel spoke. "If you raise your hand to kill me, I will not raise my hand to kill you. Indeed, I fear God, the Lord of the worlds. I want you to leave, carrying both my sin and your sin, and you will be among the companions of the fire." And that is the recompense of the wrongdoers. 3 things in these words. First, the refusal to fight back. Not inability, refusal. The deliberate, costly, chosen non-violence of someone who could have fought and chose not to. Second, the reason. I fear God. 3 words that explain everything about the choice not to raise his hand. Not, I am too afraid of you. Not, I am not strong enough. I fear God. The fear of God as the thing that ordered everything else, that placed even the most primal instinct, self-preservation, beneath the higher authority of what God required. Abel, in this moment, was doing what Cain had failed to do, ruling over what was crouching at his own door. The desire to live, the instinct to fight, the entirely understandable, entirely human response to being threatened, kept outside. By 3 words: I fear God. Third, the prophecy. I want you to leave, carrying both my sin and your sin. This is one of the most theologically significant things said by any character in the story. My sin and your sin. Abel acknowledging that he was not without sin, that he was not presenting himself as the perfect one, the pure one, the one who had never crouched at the door of anything. My sin and your sin. The righteousness of Abel was not the righteousness of someone who had never struggled. It was the righteousness of someone who had struggled and chosen correctly, who had something crouching at his own door and had kept the door closed. My sin and your sin. 2 brothers, both carrying something. The difference, not in the carrying, but in what they did with what they carried. The testimony of Abel's blood. The book of Hebrews in the New Testament says something about Abel that has stayed with me for a long time. By faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts. And through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. Though he died, he still speaks. The man who said nothing in the biblical narrative, still speaking through his blood, through the story that carries his name. Through the verse, his murder prompted about the value of every human life. Through the refusal to raise his hand that the Quran preserved for every generation since. Though he died, he still speaks. And tonight, across 6,000 years and 3 traditions, he is still speaking. What Abel's story means. Because Abel is not just a victim. He is not simply the person who was in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong brother. Abel made choices. He chose how to give. He chose how to worship. He chose not to raise his hand. He chose to fear God above everything else, including his own survival. And those choices cost him everything. In the short term, in the immediate, visible, measurable term. He died. His brother lived. His brother built a city. His brother's descendants made music and worked metal and filled the earth. And Abel was in the ground, his blood crying, his name remembered, his story told for 6,000 years to every generation that needed to hear what it looks like to rule over what is crouching at your door, even when it costs everything. Abel in the ground, his blood still crying, his name still spoken, his choice still teaching, and the verse his murder prompted still the most important thing ever written about what a life is worth. Let the ground hold what it holds. The blood still there. The name still spoken. The verse still true. And the story moving toward its final chapters. Toward the parents who lost both sons in a single day, and the child who came after and carried the line forward. Chapter 11 is waiting. Adam and Eve, the parents. The grief of 2 people who had already lost the garden, losing something even more irreplaceable. 1 son murdered. 1 son a murderer. Both gone in a single day. And the child who came after, Seth, whose name means appointed, given in place of Abel. But only when you need it. The ground is holding what it holds. The blood is still crying. And the parents are waiting in the next chapter. Adam and Eve lost both their sons in a single day. 1 murdered, 1 a murderer, both gone. The murdered one in the ground, his blood crying, his name already beginning to be what it would always be, the righteous one, the one whose offering was accepted, the one who feared God above everything, including his own life, the murderer in the land of Nod, east of Eden, building a city named after his son, alive, marked, protected, wandering but alive, and gone from his parents as completely as if he had died in the field alongside his brother. 2 sons, 1 day, both gone, the grief that nobody talks about. Because in every telling of the Cain and Abel story, the parents are almost entirely absent. The focus always on the brothers. The offering, the anger, the warning, the field, the mark, the wandering. And Adam and Eve, the people who raised these brothers, who taught them, who loved them, who watched the offering, who heard, somehow, what had happened in the field, are barely mentioned, as if their grief was secondary to the story of the people who caused it. Tonight, we are going to stay with the parents, with the grief that is, perhaps, the most quietly devastating, most human, most universally recognizable part of the entire story. The grief of parents who lost everything twice. What they had already lost. Because to understand the grief of Adam and Eve in this moment, you have to understand what they had already been carrying before the field. They had lost the garden, the presence of God, immediate and warm, the way sunlight is warm, the walking together in the cool of the evening, the rivers, the trees, the life they had always known and had never been able to fully leave behind. They had lost the innocence, the nakedness without shame, the complete openness of a relationship in which nothing needed to be hidden, the particular quality of being bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh, before the world required covering. They had carried, for years, possibly decades, the weight of knowing that the world their children lived in was harder than the world they had been made for. The guilt of parents whose choice had shaped the inheritance of their children. And then the field. Let's try to imagine how they heard. There was no messenger, no formal notification, no way in the world that Cain and Abel lived in to send word quickly across a distance. Did they see it? Were they close enough to the field to witness what happened between their sons? Did Cain come home and tell them? Did the absence of Abel at the end of the day tell them before any words were spoken? Did the mark on Cain, when they saw it, tell them everything without a sentence being said? We don't know. The text doesn't tell us. What we know is that at some point, Adam and Eve understood what had happened between their sons in the field, and had to live with that understanding for the rest of their lives. The grief for Abel, because there are two griefs, not one, and they were completely different in their nature. The grief for Abel was the grief of losing someone taken by violence before his time. The grief of looking at a life that had been full of promise, full of righteousness, full of the particular quality that God himself had looked upon with favour, cut short, not by illness, not by age, by his brother, by the 9 words in the field. The grief that had no resolution because it made no sense. The righteous do not die young in the field at the hands of their brother, and yet Abel did. The grief of parents who could not reconcile what they believed about God and the world with what had happened to their son. The grief for Cain. And then the other grief. The grief that is, perhaps, harder to talk about. The grief for Cain. Because Cain was their son too. The firstborn. The one Eve had held and said, "I have acquired a man with the help of the Lord." The one who had been, for whatever time before Abel was born, the centre of everything. The one whose hands had worked the ground every day alongside his father, who had also worked the cursed ground all his life. And now, in the land of Nod, marked, wandering, building a city east of everything they had known. Alive, but as lost to them as if he had died. The grief for the child who did the wrong thing is not less than the grief for the child who was wronged. It is different, heavier in some ways, because it carries alongside it something that the grief for Abel does not. Shame, confusion, the question that every parent of every child who has done something terrible asks in the dark. Where did we go wrong? Where did we go wrong? Because Adam and Eve, of all parents, had the most reason to ask this question. They had taught their children about God, about the creation, about the fall and the repentance and the mercy, about the offering and what it meant to give genuinely from the best of what you had. They had done what parents do. They had passed on what they knew. And Cain had heard and chosen differently. Not because his parents failed to teach him, because at some point in the interior of his own life, he had made a series of choices that led to the field. The hardest lesson that a parent can learn is that the choices of your children are not entirely yours. That you can teach, you can model, you can love, you can warn, and the child will still stand at their own door with their own crouching thing and make their own choice. The Islamic tradition on Adam's grief, the Islamic scholarship holds something about Adam's grief for Abel that is one of the most moving details in the entire tradition. Adam, the first prophet, wept for Abel. For years, some traditions hold, the grief of the father for the righteous son, taken, not natural, not expected, not the way of things. A grief so profound, so extended, so complete, that it became part of the defining experience of Adam's time on earth. The man who had wept for the garden, now weeping for his son. Two griefs in one life. The loss of the presence of God as he had known it, and the loss of the child who had best reflected that presence back into the world. Eve, the mother, and Eve, the mother of all living, who had held both of them as infants, who had named one Cain, saying, "I have acquired a man with the help of the Lord," who had held Abel, the second, the younger, the shepherd, the one God looked upon with favour, the mother who had lost both in a way that no parent is meant to experience. Not one, but two, not to age, not to illness, but to each other, to the thing that crouching at one son's door had walked through and taken everything. Eve, the mother of all living, who knew on the day the field happened that the living she was the mother of had done something to each other that could not be undone, and who carried that knowledge for the rest of her life. Seth, and then the mercy again, because the story does not end with the grief. Adam, the text tells us, knew his wife again, and she bore a son, and called his name Seth. For, she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. Seth, the name meaning appointed, given, placed, in place of, not a replacement for Abel, not someone who made the grief go away, but an appointment, something given by God into the space that the grief had opened, a life where a life had been taken, a beginning in the place of an ending. The same mercy that had run through every chapter of this story, running through this one too, not erasing the grief, not undoing the field, walking alongside it, giving into the hands that were empty from loss, something to hold. The line from Seth, because from Seth came something that the text marks as significant. To Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. At that time people began to call upon the name of the Lord. At that time people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Not from the line of Cain, with its cities and its music and its metalwork. From the line of Seth, from the appointed one, from the child given into the grief of Adam and Eve, came the calling on the name of God, the worship, the relationship with the divine that would run through the generations, through Noah, through Abraham, through Moses, through the long, patient, ongoing chain of the human story, turning back toward the presence it had lost in the garden. Adam and Eve, who lost everything twice, the garden and their sons, and Seth, given into the grief, appointed by the same God who never closed the door. Let the grief settle into the evening. Adam and Eve together, Seth between them, the grief real, the mercy real, both at the same time, both entirely human. Chapter 12 is the last one, the long sleep. What the story means, why it has been told for 6,000 years, what it says about jealousy, about warning, about the door that is always still open, and the question that runs through every chapter tonight. At what point does a feeling become a choice? And at what point does a choice become something that cannot be undone? But only when you need it. The grief is real. The mercy is real. Seth is in their arms. This story is 6,000 years old, maybe older. The oldest written version, the earliest fragments, going back to the dawn of human writing itself. And before writing, spoken, around fires, like this one, parent to child, generation to generation. The same story, told in the same darkness, under the same stars, for longer than civilization has existed. And tonight, it was told again, to you, in the dark. Which means that whatever this story does, it is still doing it. still asking the question that it has always asked, still pointing at the door, still warning about the crouching thing, still saying, "You must rule over it." What the story is really about. Because the story of Cain and Abel, on the surface, is about two brothers and a field, and the first murder in human history. But underneath, it is about something much more immediate, much more personal, much more uncomfortably recognizable. It is about the sequence, the slow, quiet, almost invisible sequence from a feeling to a choice to something that cannot be undone. The sequence that nobody ever intends to complete. That everyone at the beginning of it believes they will stop before the end. The feeling was jealousy, the comparison, the burning of watching someone else receive what you wanted. Human, understandable, not wrong in itself. The choice was to feed it, not to examine it, not to bring it to the one who was still asking, "Why are you angry?" To feed it, to let it grow, to walk past the door that was pointed at toward the field where the crouching thing was waiting. At what point does a feeling become a choice? This is the question that has run through every chapter tonight. And the story gives us a precise answer. The feeling became a choice when Cain heard the warning and did not act on it. Not when the anger arrived, not when the offering was rejected, not even when the comparison first began, when the warning was given and ignored, when the door was pointed at and walked past. The feeling became a choice in the silence between God's words and Cain's footsteps toward the field. In the moment when Cain had everything he needed to choose differently and chose the same direction anyway. That is when the feeling became a choice. At what point does a choice become something that cannot be undone? The field. 9 words, after which nothing was ever the same again. Abel in the ground, the blood crying, the parents beginning the grief they would carry for the rest of their lives, the wandering beginning, the city of Nod beginning, the mark given, the 7-fold protection declared. The field was the point at which the choice became the thing that could not be undone. And the extraordinary thing about this story is not that Cain reached the field. The extraordinary thing is how many times before the field the direction could have changed. The doors that were open, let's count them, because this is perhaps the most important thing the story has to say. The offering rejected, door open. If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? The acceptance still available, still reachable. One door. The warning. Sin is crouching at your door. You must rule over it. The crouching thing. still outside. The door, still Cain's. 2 doors. The invitation to the field. Let us go out to the field. Even there, even in those 5 words, the choice had not yet been made. 3 doors. And after the field, after the 9 words, after the blood crying from the ground, where is your brother? Still asking. Still the question. Not for information, but for Cain. Still the invitation to honesty, to acknowledgement, to the beginning of what the Quranic account called becoming of the regretful. 4 doors. 4 open doors. Before and after the worst thing happened. The most important word in the story. If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? Will you not? The most hopeful, most merciful, most quietly extraordinary phrase in the entire chapter. Not, you might be accepted. Not, there is a chance. Will you not be accepted? The certainty of the acceptance if the right thing is done. The door, not just open, but guaranteed to open if Cain would only turn toward it. Will you not? The rhetorical question that contains its own answer. Of course you will. Of course the acceptance is there. Of course the door opens when the right thing is done. It always has. It always does. It always will. What the 3 traditions agree on. Because, despite everything that separates them, the Jewish, the Christian, the Islamic traditions tell this story to say the same essential things. The crouching thing is real. Every person has something crouching at their door. The comparison, the resentment, the anger, unexamined, unfed, unaddressed, real, present, crouching, and the door is always still open after the rejection, open after the anger, open after the warning ignored, open after the field, after the 9 words, after the blood crying from the ground, still open, still the question being asked, still the invitation being extended. Still, the same God who warned Cain, asking, "Where is your brother?" Not for information, but for you. The question for tonight. Because the story ends with a question for you. Not, are you Cain? Not, are you Abel? Not, which brother do you most resemble? The question is simpler and harder than that. What is crouching at your door right now? Not Cain's door, yours. The thing that has been building slowly, quietly, for longer than you want to admit. The comparison you keep going back to. The resentment you have been feeding without quite deciding to feed it. The anger you have told yourself is justified so many times that you have stopped questioning it. What is crouching at your door? And more importantly, what are you doing with it? The warning is still being given, because the warning God gave Cain was not only for Cain, it is for every person who has felt the burning of comparison, every person who has watched someone else receive what they wanted and felt the slow, quiet darkening of something inside them, every person who has recognized the early stages of something building that should not be building and chosen not to address it. The warning is still being given in the discomfort that arrives when something is building that shouldn't be, in the unease of feeding what deserves to starve, in the question that surfaces in the quiet moments, is this where I want this to go? The warning is the mercy before the catastrophe. It is always given before the field. The question is whether we hear it. And you, wherever this found you, whatever brought you here tonight, you stayed. You followed the story from the world outside the garden, to the offering, to the anger, to the warning, to the field, to the mark, to the wandering, to the blood still crying, to the parents holding Seth, to this. You stayed, which means something, which means the story is still doing what it has always done, asking, warning, pointing at the door, saying in the most direct possible way, the crouching thing is outside, not inside, outside. And you, right now, tonight, have everything you need to keep it there. The door is still open, the warning still given, the acceptance still available, and the question still being asked. Where are you? You just spent 3 hours with the oldest murder story ever told. And you stayed, which means you are exactly the kind of person who belongs here. Subscribe, like, and leave a comment telling me one thing from tonight that you didn't know before. Next, is a secret. Good night.